Hello, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events that are going on in your world today. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for those who are interested and active in the field of depth and Jungian psychologies. And my guest today is Patricia Damery, and Patricia is an analyst member of the C.G. Jung Institute of San Francisco, and she's also in private psychotherapy practice in Napa, California. And what's unique about Patricia is that she and her husband farm a biodynamic organic ranch, and we're going to hear a little bit about that and about how it connects to Jungian and depth psychology. And meanwhile, Patricia has published numerous articles and poems, but among other things, we'll be talking about her book, Farming Soul, A Tale of Initiation, which weaves an absolutely fascinating tale of her analytic training and simultaneous entry into biodynamic farming. Patricia, it's great to have you with me today. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you.
Well, you've been busy. You have in addition to this book, which I have to say I found absolutely fascinating and such an accessible and compelling read. I started reading it last night and I could not put it down. So I'm really intrigued by your process of writing and what led you to that point, and hopefully we'll talk about that. But you also have a new novel called Snakes, which has just come out this year. And
yes.
And you're also co-editing an anthology that is going to be published in March of 2012. So
yes.
Maybe what we can do is just have you talk about seeing some of your work come to fruition right now.
Well, it's really quite a process. It's very different from the writing of it, of course. The novel that came out is one that I really wrote first. I joined a writers group 26 years ago now, a women's writers group, and I'm still in that group. But it was through that, when I started writing the snake stories that were very compelling to me growing up in the Midwest, that being held with this group of women, the stories being held, I realized there was a much bigger story in them. And so they gradually became a novel. It is fiction. It's not my life, but of course a lot of it comes from growing up on a small farm in the Midwest. So all my life I've written, and I published very little, really, until the last few years. And this year I've published quite a bit. And as my publisher, Mel Matthews of Fisher King Press, said to me when he met me on the steps of the Jung Institute, when he handed me my first copy of Farming Soul, he said, "This is going to change your life." And he was absolutely right, because there is something about standing behind my experience of the world that I have really kept somewhat secret or private among a very particular group of people. And to stand behind it and say, this is how I see the world, and this is what I see as important, and have it published and have then to deal with people's reactions to it is it's an experience that I'm really glad I've had, but it is huge. It is not altogether easy. It's actually scary sometimes. But it's also one that I wish everybody had the experience of in one way or the other. Maybe not publishing a book. It might be on some other avenue, but it's been a real growth experience for me.
You know, I think you put your finger on something that is what really was compelling to me about reading Farming Soul, and that was that it's your authentic voice that's coming through. I think that you've managed to tap into something that everybody can relate to, and you do it through telling stories, and you do it through weaving the process of becoming a Jungian analyst alongside your own story with your own childhood memories and the way that you came to be able to integrate these two things that were going on in your life, actually more than two, but the two things that stand out for me was the process of really finding yourself in becoming a Jungian analyst and some of the activities and things that you pursued alongside that, as well as this whole idea of becoming a biodynamic farmer, which wasn't probably totally foreign to you, but was certainly something very powerful. And I think it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the process of publishing your writing, not just the process of writing, but also the process of publishing it, in some ways is as much an initiation as the process that you describe in Farming Soul.
Absolutely.
Maybe you could talk just for a minute about your take on initiation, because not only is it something that is in the subtitle of Farming Soul, but, Jung also went through his own initiation, which is documented in his Red Book. And it's such an archetype that is so powerfully present in most of our lives. If you think about the idea of individuation and personal growth in order to become more whole, certainly we can't possibly do that without initiation. Can you just share a little bit about your thoughts on that and how it's affected your own life?
Well, I would say that the most, and perhaps one of the larger initiations I had, was becoming an analyst. And in the archetype of initiation, of course, is where you're taken out of the community and you go through a dismemberment or death, symbolic death, hopefully. But if you don't make it, it can be a death, certainly in certain rituals in various cultures. And then you are given new organs. You're reassembled, and then you come back into society and you take your place as an adult, as an initiate, with these new organs or new eyes in the way that you see things. And so I think that my experience, which honestly was horrific, there's no other way to describe parts of it. The institute that I was being certified through was in a time of tremendous stress and crisis itself. And it really didn't have the energy to put out to do very good training, as far as I'm concerned. And so there were a lot of mistakes made, and we had to withdraw our projections as candidates. And I had to withdraw mine of having this perfect initiator, this place where I would be received with open arms, and really have to look within myself for, some of the darkest parts of me, the part that my low self-esteem. I had to really address that, and the part of me that I do keep secret. Many Midwesterners are very private about experience, and I still have that in me, but to come up against a very different system and say, well, this is who I am anyway. I had to seek out different teachers. I had to say, I'm not going to get what I need here, and that's okay. So the teachers I sought were very alternative, unconventional teachers, and had I not had those teachers, I wouldn't have made it through it. And after I had that training, one of them was a psychic. One was a really beloved analyst who had studied for a number of years with a Navajo medicine man, Don Sandner. And he was very important to me. And then I had a variety of consultants who were important. That really, for me, is where the core was. And my analysis. I had a wonderful analysis, but in the end, it couldn't hold what I needed to do. And so in the end, I had to take my authority back into myself. And I think that is the sign that an initiation has taken place, is where you accept responsibility for your life and not blame others for what you didn't get, but kind of land on the planet with your feet on the ground and say, okay, this is where I am, this is who I am, I take responsibility for it.
Right. And of course what you're describing is, again, quite archetypal in nature. Joseph Campbell talks about the hero's journey and how, all of us have to go to the underworld and fight demons and dragons there, essentially. And and if we survive, as you say, there are all kinds of symbolic deaths. And if we survive, then what happens is the hero returns with a gift that then can be given back to the community.
Yes.
And you talk, what we're talking about here is quite, in some terminology, some people would look at this as almost shamanic, because there's this idea of a shamanic illness in which Those who are tapped to become shamans in traditional cultures are often called on a very initiatory journey, often being, as you mentioned, dismembered and then remembered with the new organs. And you allude to that also in the idea of having the unconventional teachers and other states of consciousness in farming soul. Yes. Can you talk about your experience with other states of consciousness, as you call them, and how that has affected you?
Yes, I used to think about it as being other states of consciousness, and to some degree it is. I think that I have always had access to, now what I think of it as is it's like having more of my consciousness present. It's not only the everyday consciousness, but some of that theta and delta and alpha, and having access to more of that in my everyday beta consciousness. But I didn't have the training to really be able to name it and to be able to develop tools to use it. And so one of the crises for me came through a shamanic conference that I was attending, in which we were studying the overlap of shamanism and analytical psychology. And I had a vision. I wouldn't even call it a vision. I saw spiritual energy. I saw the spiritual energy of death, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I ignored it. I think that was a horrible mistake, because the next day the man was killed that this spiritual energy was sitting beside. And it was in the sweat lodge, so, it is a time that other states of consciousness could be present as well. And so that really, I descended deeply after that, and to try to take responsibility for what I had seen and what I had done. I felt like some of what we did on that conference was a little bit like a psychic amusement park. You can go in, you can get into these ecstatic states, and it is high, and everybody feels all of this love. And then you go home. We went home, and this man was killed on the way home. And I think that had we been more grounded, I don't know if I had said something to him or to the leader, the Lakota medicine woman who was leading the lodge at the time. I don't know if it could have been prevented. I don't know that it's cause and effect, but I do know I had a responsibility in seeing that, and so I had to find out, how do I handle, if I have these sensitivities, how do I handle it? And my analytic training wasn't even getting close to that. It wasn't, there's many other wonderful things in analytic training, but training in that is not one of them. And so I had to find teachers and people who would believe me, not just write it off as, some pathological state I was in.
Right. Yeah, that's a very powerful example, I think, of a form of initiation. And, that kind of experience is one that can truly throw it into chaos, wondering, questioning ourselves and wondering, in hindsight, what the right action should have been. This brings up a theme that you talk about quite regularly in Farming Soul and in some of your other writing as well, and that is this idea of separation of spirituality from psychology, and how sitting in the sweat lodge and being able to see energy in a sort of a different state of consciousness than our everyday consciousness is something that some people and some cultures take for granted, and yet you had a very real direct experience of it. And yet, how does that integrate with your experience of studying to be a Jungian analyst, or does it?
Well, it had to. Although there are many of my colleagues who would consider it not a part, it doesn't belong in psychology. But I do think that we stunt ourselves if we are not open to, I think people experience spiritual energy in different ways. Some so-called see it, some feel it in their gut. I think it's often felt as a sense of this opening of the heart. But I think that for me, moving through this, I really felt like this is who I am, and when I work, there's got to be a place for it. it's there anyway. If I don't pay attention to it, I start getting this in the past. I don't have this so much now because I really believe in myself, and when I start feeling something, I believe in what I'm feeling, or what I'm seeing, for that matter. But before, I would get anxiety. It was something would be building up, and I would just feel this anxiety and not know what to do. My teachers helped me with that. The psychic teacher in particular, first of all, she affirmed what was going on. That was very important for me. And then she gave me specific tools about how to handle that. And it was not only her, I also worked with a homeopath and a healer during that time around the energetic states that were happening in my body and how to ground that and not turn it into physical symptoms and illnesses, which I was also doing.
Right, and I have to just say as an aside, I think that's also, it's a very natural thing for us to do as human beings, but it's something that is definitely affecting us as a culture as well, because, I mean, it's almost impossible not to do that unless you have a tremendous amount of awareness around it, and also, as you mentioned, some tools or some training to be able to explore what that is and to really prevent it from turning into those kinds of symptoms that you're referring to.
Yes. Yes.
You know, that makes me think, again, I alluded earlier to Jung and this idea of initiation, which really came out in the Red Book. And, of course, you know, the story was that some people that were close to Jung were very concerned about releasing the Red Book because it illustrated quite vividly his own experience of entering into some of these realms, which we would call more spiritual or more energetic. Yes. And when people ask me what depth psychology is, people who are not familiar with it, of course, Jung, as one of the founders of depth psychology, really he was very committed to making sure it was founded in science. But you can see over the course of his own growth and individuation as a professional, as a psychologist, that it became more and more spiritual for him, and he was more and more willing to delve into and allow those kinds of spiritual experiences to come out.
Yes.
And I think it's very important in our society today, and particularly in psychotherapy, to be inclusive of these kinds of ideas and energies and not to shut them down. Do you find that there's a trend in your work and in the work of fellow Jungian analysts that are able to embrace more of the spiritual aspect?
I have colleagues that I feel close to who embrace the spiritual, but there are equally those who do not. And probably more. But what I do find is that I have more and more people coming to me who have spiritual experiences that could be pathologized. And if you're not sensitive to being able to sort through what is pathology and what may be an experience of spiritual energy, and sometimes it's both, but you're liable to really injure that person. That isn't talked about very much. It can be talked about the other way, that you're looking at it spiritually and missing some real pathology. I believe that we attract people to us that are the right people for us to work with, but there are a lot of people in my practice that are very attuned to the spiritual world, and in various ways. Some are healers, some are psychotherapists, some are wilderness leaders. But I do feel that on the planet, the frequency is raising. I think more and more people are attuned to the spirit. And I feel that's so important. It feels critical that we can make shifts on our planet that we're going to need to make if life's going to continue, at least as we've known it.
Yes, again, I tend to agree with you completely. One thing that's coming to my mind, of course, is, I mean, you brought it up about the planet, but it's also related to our connection to the planet and to nature in general. And I know, of course, because you're a biodynamic farmer, and also because I have your book, Farming Soul, I know that connection to nature is important to you. as it was to Jung. And we have some amazing writing from him on that. Can you talk about your connection to nature and what it means to you, and maybe just a little bit about your story? Which came first? Was it the farm or the love of nature or the entree into the field as a Jungian analyst that came first? How are all those related for you in your life?
Well, I grew up on a farm, and so I think that I early on learned to love land, an experience that I think a lot of people no longer get to have. I literally have a physical love of the land we live on now, and I know in part that is because I can recognize it in the way that I grew up. We played outside. We interacted with the dirt and the trees and the grass, and my father was a farmer. You could see it in his face when at the end of winter when he'd go back out into the fields. There would just be this peace that came over him. And I remember going to bed, being put to bed, and my mother would play the piano while she would be waiting for my father to come in from the field, and off in the distance I could hear the tractor. To me, it was a feeling of wholeness. Everything is okay, and there was this feeling of wholeness. And I had a variety of dreams as a child that really had that kind of oceanic state of consciousness in them. And I sought it out. To me, that was spiritual. I would go outside at night when the sun was setting, and I would just feel at one with the cornfield, with the sun, with the air. It was this, it would sustain me. But I hated farm work. I'll also have to say that. And so I couldn't get out of there fast enough. That's the irony of it. And I decided I kind of wanted to be a hunter-gatherer, one who hikes and goes out with a backpack, but, it doesn't work all the time. And so it wasn't until I married my husband about 17 years ago and moved to the ranch here in Napa that I fell in love with a piece of land again. That's not entirely true. We lived in Guerneville, and I really loved the place I raised my sons in the redwoods and on the Russian River. But I love this ranch, and I love it so much. It is my piece of earth that I will do anything I can to help it. And that's where biodynamics comes in. And at the time that I was going through my certification, we had another ranch and it was about this time of year, and the grapes weren't ripening. So a friend of mine said, I know somebody that can ripen those grapes. And so we were desperate. We were about to lose a lot of money. And so we contacted him. And in 10 days, he raised those grapes. He brought them up, probably about 6 weeks' worth of ripening. He basically brought them up to where they should have been at that time of year through a series of sprays, and basically saved the grape crop. So using very homeopathic amounts of various substances to balance forces in the vineyard. And I remember one day my husband and I went up to the ranch while he was spraying, and there was a fruit bin of this green liquid with a stick across it with strings hanging down. And I said to my husband, I wonder what that is. And he said, let's not even think about it. It was so weird. But it worked. And that was not strictly biodynamics. He was a real maverick, you might say. He did things that biodynamic practitioners do not traditionally do. But after he saved that crop, we hired him for a year to teach us how to do it on our ranch here where we live now, because the grapes were not doing well. And that's where we got into it and realized, oh, this is so similar to what I was doing as a candidate. And in my analysis, you have to pay attention when you're stirring these preparations to everything you're putting into it. It's said that when you start using the preparations, that the plants and the land are more sensitive to your intention, and I believe that's true. So if you're projecting, this field is not giving enough, it's a disappointment, well, it will not disappoint you. It will be a disappointment. And if you're projecting, kind of melding with love, not only do things seem to thrive, but more important, we do too. That feeling of being in love with the land comes. So it really is a kind of analysis through relationship to land.
I really love that because it's such a metaphor that I think everybody can relate to, and that just makes me think. There was a passage in your book, Farming Soul, that really struck me as an excellent, a description of what biodynamic farming is, and I just wanted to quote out of this. This is on page 12, and you say, in here you say, there's nothing in nature that does not bear relation to the whole. The work for the farmer, then, is not killing the aphids that have suddenly arrived on a lettuce, but studying the conditions that resulted in the appearance of aphids and using developed thinking to comprehend the connections between them.
Yes.
And I just thought that was such a vivid example of how everything is interconnected. And, if one thing is going wrong over here, then there's certainly something somewhere else that, is an equal contributor to the issue.
And you see, that method came from Gerda, and it is very much the method that Jung also employed, because Jung was also a student of Gerda. Steiner, who was the father of biodynamics, Rudolf Steiner, and Carl Jung both were contemporaries. They weren't very friendly with each other. I don't know if they ever met, but they didn't have nice things to say about each other, but their work has some surprisingly similar roots. And that whole thing about taking in what you see, and only then, after you've taken it in, making sense of it, using your developed thinking to make sense of it. That is, that's how I work as an analyst, and that's how I work as a farmer.
Mm-hmm. And I think that awareness can really be powerful in all of our lives. If we just slow down long enough to pay attention and to look and to listen. And again, I just can't say enough, Patricia, about your book, because when I was reading the book, that's exactly what happened to me. Somehow you've managed to write it in a way that really allowed me to slow down and just be with your words. And the words were more than just words on a page. They really elicited this feeling of kind of that oceanic state of consciousness that you referred to earlier. And it reminds me of a quote from Jung. It's one of my favorite quotes, and he says, "At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the plashing of the waves, in the clouds and the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. There is nothing with which I'm not linked."
Wow.
And that's in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which
beautiful.
is a really powerful, I think, summary also of your work as well. So I really wanted to thank you for your time today. It goes so quickly, but I'm just so grateful for your contribution, and I want to mention that both Farming Soul and Snakes are published. You mentioned it, but they are published by Fisher King Press, which has an absolutely wonderful selection of books in the depth psychology arena, yours as well as many other great books. And just coincidentally, Mel Matthews and Fisher King Press are generously offering to donate 10% of all the purchases that come from Depth Psychology Alliance members in the month of October to the Alliance.
Great.
So I hope that Alliance members who hear this will go check out your books, Farming Soul and Snakes, as well as all of the other amazing books that are on the Fisher King Press website. And then, Patricia, can you just briefly tell us where can we find more information about you? I know that you have a blog that you contribute to regularly, which I actually tweet regularly as well. And You also have a couple of sites, a couple of Facebook sites that are for both your biodynamic farming, the lavender, which we didn't get around to talking about, but people can find out more. Just tell us a little bit about where people can go.
Our ranch has a website, which is Harms Lavender, HARMS, harmslavender.com. And we also have a blog, Harms Farm Log, that is more immediate about what's happening every day. I've published several articles in the Jung journal, Culture and Psyche, which is also a wonderful journal, by the way, out of the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and I think really supports writers. It has certainly supported me, and it's a great journal to subscribe to, actually.
Definitely. So, I do subscribe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, excellent. And then also I know that more on a depth psychological or Jungian take on things. There is information also about your books at patriciadamery.com, which is spelled PATRICIADAMERY.com.
That's right. Yes.
Patricia, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. It's been such a joy to both read your book and to share a little bit of time talking with you, and I hope we can do this again sometime soon.
Yes, it was a real honor to participate. Thank you.
Thank you.